see birds, hummingbirds, enjoy them for their beauty, but what do we really know about them? Did you know right around the corner from Toledo is the Black Swamp Observatory, and we're with the Education Director, Kim Kaufman.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for coming today.
A pleasure. All right, Kim, tell me something about birds that we don't know.
Okay, let's pick a very charismatic bird like the ruby-throated hummingbird.
Okay.
Most people, if they even have a passing interest in birds, have heard of hummingbirds and have tried to attract them to their yard. But what you might not know is that tiny little bird does an amazing thing. They are migratory species, and they migrate, many of them, down in Mexico. So they have to do something pretty amazing. They have to cross the Gulf of Mexico.
Seriously?
Yes, absolutely. This tiny little bird, it's approximately an 18-hour flight. 18 hours of nonstop flight, because if you stop, you're in the water and you're a goner. And what's even more amazing, let me show you something, Susan.
Okay.
The Bird Observatory does migratory bird research, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'm going to use this pen as a prop today to show you. I'm going to put this on the scale. In terms of bird research, we measure birds in grams. So this pen, 8.2 grams, okay? A ruby-throated hummingbird weighs about 3 to 3.5 grams. So that bird that weighs almost half of what this pen weighs, can fly 18 hours nonstop across the Gulf of Mexico in migration.
It doesn't land.
There's no place to land.
It doesn't eat.
It doesn't eat. It flies for 18 hours straight and weighs less than this pen.
How? Why? How? Why? I don't understand.
You don't, well, okay, picture this. A lot of ruby-throated hummingbirds nest in the state of Ohio. Okay. If you're a species that drinks nectar from flowers and eats insects, and you're here in the winter, you're in a big heap of trouble. So you've got to migrate. You've got to migrate where there's a consistent source of food and shelter. So over the ages, thousands and thousands of years, birds have evolved into migratory species. So in other words, the birds are here, they're hanging out with us, nesting here for the summer, delighting us with their antics right outside of our window. And then as the day length starts to change, the birds are driven by instinct to migrate, and they're going to go down to different areas. Some, like the ruby-throated hummingbird, nest in overwinter in Mexico. Nest here, overwinter in Mexico. Many species will migrate even farther down into the tropics, some going as far as Brazil. The Bird Observatory is committed to migratory bird research. It's what founded the observatory in 1992. We have ornithologists and researchers who started out doing projects and then realized after several years that if we don't educate people about our findings, then what good is the research? So the observatory was created as an outlet for all that information, and now we've really ramped up our educational efforts. As the education director, it's my job to figure out a way to tie in all those research findings into educational programs to inspire the public to fall in love with birds, but to also care about the resources that make it possible for those birds to be here and thrive.
Can you show us a little bit about what you did? Can you tell us about the banding?
The banding process is really interesting. First of all, the method of capture are mist nets. And this is a very small sample of what a mist net looks like. It's very fine black thread. In the field, this net is stretched among telescoping poles, and it's stretched out 12 feet high and 42 feet long. And if you look behind here, you can imagine this against the trees, it almost totally disappears. The birds can't see it. They fly in and they're sort of gently swept down and cradled into a little pocket that looks like this.
So it doesn't hurt them?
No, the birds are not harmed. And in fact, safety is our #1 concern in the research field. And the volunteers will spend more hours in training about the safety of the birds than anything else that we do. It's the #1 priority. So the birds are held in these little pockets in the net. Volunteers are trained after many, many hours of observation and training to extract the birds from the net carefully so that they're not harmed. This is a little palm warbler that's in the net here. And then they're taken back to the station where a series of measurements is taken. A band is placed on their leg, and the bands look something like this. Here's a variety of sizes. Because birds are different sizes, and obviously they have different sized legs, the bands come in a variety of sizes. The banders are trained to know, #1, what's the identification of this bird? What kind of bird is this? Because then you have to know what size band that bird would take.
So which bird would use this tiny band?
Okay, this tiny band is the tiniest band that we have other than a hummingbird band, and yes, we do band hummingbirds. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. This is a size 0A, and this is the size that a palm warbler would take. A very tiny, it's a bit smaller than something like an American goldfinch that the viewers may be more familiar with.
Okay.
So this tiny little band, so there's a difference in sizes, but what's the same in every band is that they're issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and every one of them has an individual number stamped on this band.
Okay.
And so that if this bird is ever recovered again, this little palm warbler that maybe will get this band, if he's recovered again either at our station or by another bird banding station, suddenly all this information that we've collected becomes invaluable. Now we'll know that if this bird goes on down to the tropics, let's say this bird goes on down to Mexico or Costa Rica, and a banding station there recaptures it, we'll know that this bird took X amount of time to go from the Lake Erie Marsh region down to its wintering ground, how long it took, what condition is the bird in when it gets there. Suddenly you can start to see all of the information that you can get by having the bird in the hand and putting a band on its leg. The way that we do that is to communicate and coordinate our efforts with other bird banding stations, so that in other words, if this spring we catch 400 palm warblers, and that's about an average, okay, that's great, we're doing all right. If a station to the north of us, like maybe some that are up in the UP of Michigan, don't catch any, if they're not communicating with us, they may think, wow, what happened to the population of palm warblers? But we can communicate and say, no, everything's okay. We're on an average pace for palm warblers from the year. Maybe they just overflew you. In other words, maybe they were riding a strong wind. They didn't stop into your station this year. But yes, we can absolutely monitor population trends. And in the Lake Erie Marsh region, we have a unique opportunity to do that because of this habitat. We refer to this habitat as stopover habitat. In other words, migrating birds, they can't go the entire distance without stopping to rest and refuel, eat insects and feed.
Okay.
And that's what this represents to millions of migratory birds. And in fact, birders from all over the world will come right here to the Lake Erie Marsh region to get a shot at these birds. Because they can't see them. They're in remote areas on their wintering grounds down south, and where they're nesting, oftentimes it's up in the far reaches in the tundra where it's inaccessible. So this is our little brief window to see some really beautiful birds, and that's what this area represents, stopover habitat.
Well, how lucky we are in Northwest Ohio.
Yes, we're very lucky.
All right, so so you're starting to band them.
Right.
Does it hurt them when you band them?
Oh, absolutely not. The band is so lightweight. It's not any different than you wearing a wedding ring or a wristwatch. So no, there's no harm to the birds. And in fact, we've caught birds, tiny birds like in the warbler family that have reached the age of about 9 years old carrying that band. So we know that it doesn't cause any harm to the bird to carry the weight of that band.
Is that the average age of them, 9?
No, actually, that's something that we learned through banding. The average age of a songbird, a small bird, is thought to be about two years. Pretty short lifespan, considering all that they have to do in those 2 years. But we've been able to establish some longevity records in a couple of species. One, the yellow warbler, which nests here in the state of Ohio. This bird will do a round-trip migration of about 4,000 miles down to Costa Rica and then back here again to breed. So we caught a bird that was 9 years old. So that bird has gone approximately at least 36,000 miles. I mean,
in its little lifetime.
Right, in its little lifetime. It weighs about 9 grams. So it's pretty incredible. So,
all right, so we're on to the next.
So this is just an example of closing the band onto the bird's leg, which is done very carefully. Then we measure wing chord. A bird's wing is somewhat like your hand on the end of yours. So the wrist is like the shoulder of the bird. And we'll measure the length of the wing chord. And oftentimes we can tell a lot about particular species just by having the length of the wing. We can sometimes differentiate between sexes of birds just by using that wing chord measurement.
I was going to ask you that. How do you know the difference between a male and female?
Oftentimes it's in plumage differences. Things like a northern cardinal that most people are familiar with, the male looks quite different from the female. There's a striking plumage difference. But the blue jay, for example, the male and female look identical. And some of the smaller birds, which we refer to as passerines in the technical language, sometimes the male will have a longer wing chord. And by measuring wing chord on dozens and actually hundreds and hundreds of samples of these birds, we can start to differentiate sex through wing chord. So another aspect that we learned from banding. Then this is going to look really strange, but the feathers on the belly are separated. You blow on the feathers of the belly. These birds are stopping over here and eating a lot of insects and storing up fat, and they do it a little differently than humans. It's really visible under the skin. So the bander will blow apart the feathers to get a look at the skin, and we rate the amount of fat that a bird has on a numerical scale. You can start to see it's a long process of learning how to band a bird.
But if they're not eating for days and days and days at a time, they need that fat, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So what will happen is, if we band a bird in our area and it has no fat, when we first capture it, we'll know that bird must have just arrived. It's just coming into the Lake Erie Marsh region, having migrated from somewhere deep in the tropics. And after 3 or 4 days, oftentimes we'll recatch that same bird, recapture it, and it'll have a fat level of 2 or 3. In other words, it's building fat, and we're starting to put together a timeline for this bird. It's going to stay in the Lake Erie Marsh region 3 or 4 days, store up a lot of fat on all the insects that are available in the marsh region, and wait for a good southwest wind, and blow on out of here. Part of the last process is that birds are unlike pets. You can't teach them to sit and stay on the scale so that we can take the weight, which is the final step in the process. So the birds are placed in a paper holding cone. It looks bizarre, but the birds are not harmed. It's dark in there, so they feel safe. They're put on a scale and weighed, as I said, in grams, and then released. And here's a photo of an American robin being released.
About how long did that whole process take?
A lot longer than it took for me to just explain it to you. Typically, because we've been doing this for so long, and the banders that work for the Bird Observatory are so well trained, some of the birds, by the time we have them in our hand, put the band on, take all the measurements, less than a minute. Less than 1 minute.
So for them, it was just a few split
momentary
seconds?
Kidnapping, if you will, and then back into the marsh. And studies have shown that the birds, actually, when they're in the wild, they exude more stress in the wild than they do in our hand. In other words, the energy level is a lot less as the bird is being held than it is out in the wild. So do birds get stressed? Yes, of course they do. But what we can learn from having these birds in the hands is vital to area land managers and even private land owners on how to manage habitat for migratory birds in a particular timing when these birds are coming through.
You know, Kim, you've taught us so much about them and to appreciate them. But at Today's Home Design, we really like to incorporate things into our home and our yard.
Oh, absolutely.
Would you be able to help us make our yard more friendly so that the birds, the hummingbirds, they'll all come and visit us?
I'd love to.